The encounter. The alien bazaar was alive with noise and color. Vendors shouted, advertising strange fruits, shimmering fabrics, and glowing trinkets. The air smelled of spices, metal, and something distinctly alien. Thomas Carter, a respected human diplomat, walked through the crowded market. His mission was simple: negotiate trade routes with the neighboring planets. But as he passed stalls filled with curious eyes, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the shadows near the market's edge. There, sitting against a crumbling wall, was a figure wrapped in tattered cloth. Her head was bowed, her hands clutching a dented tin cup. She didn't beg like the others, didn't plead for help. She simply sat there, quiet and still, as the crowd ignored her. Thomas stopped. Something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was her silence in a place so full of noise, or maybe it was her eyes when they briefly glanced up, large, golden, and filled with something he couldn't name. Pain, fear, defiance. "Sir, we should move on," said his assistant, a young man named Eric. "This part of the market isn't safe." Thomas didn't reply. He crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with the beggar. Her alien features became clearer, a pale, almost translucent complexion, delicate ridges along her cheekbones, and faint markings on her forehead that suggested a tribal heritage. She was beautiful in a haunting, otherworldly way. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. The alien flinched, her hands tightening around the cup. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "Lara." Thomas smiled softly. "Lara, do you need help?" She looked at him, her golden eyes narrowing. Why would a human care about an alien beggar? Before Thomas could answer, a burly alien vendor nearby barked a laugh. "Careful, human. That one's nothing but trouble. Picked her up off the streets years ago. A waste of space." Thomas turned to the vendor, his expression hardening. "She's a person, not trash." The vendor sneered but said nothing more, turning his attention back to his stall. Lara watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. "Why would you defend me?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "You don't know me." Thomas shrugged. "Maybe I don't need to." Eric tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Sir, we really need to go. This isn't safe." Thomas hesitated. He didn't know why he felt so drawn to Lara, but something in his gut told him not to leave her here. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of rations, placing it in her lap. Lara stared at the offering, her hands trembling. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Thomas said firmly. "It's an offer. Take it or leave it." She hesitated, her pride and hunger warring visibly on her face. Finally, she grabbed the packet and stuffed it into the folds of her cloak. "Fine, but I don't owe you anything." "Fair enough," Thomas replied, standing up. "But if you ever want more than just food, come find me. I'm staying at the embassy." As he turned to leave, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He glanced around the market, his diplomatic instincts kicking in. Among the crowd, a tall, hooded figure stood watching him. Their face was obscured, but their attention was unmistakable, focused entirely on Lara. Thomas's hand instinctively moved toward the communicator on his belt. He didn't like the feeling in the air. Something about this encounter wasn't right. But before he could act, the figure melted into the crowd, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. "Let's go," Thomas said to Eric, his tone more urgent now. As they left the market, Lara sat still, clutching the rations. Her gaze lingered on Thomas's retreating figure. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her with kindness instead of disgust. But kindness was dangerous. It led to trust, and trust could get you killed. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and stood, slipping into the shadows of the alley. The rations were a temporary relief, but they wouldn't solve her real problem. The hooded figure had been watching her again, just as they had for weeks. And now, thanks to the human diplomat, they had a reason to act. As the sun set over the alien city, Lara knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change. For better or worse. "This is just the beginning," the figure whispered before disappearing into the night. Secrets unveiled. The dimly lit room of the human embassy was silent except for the steady hum of a security drone patrolling the perimeter. Thomas leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed as he watched Lara pace the room like a caged animal. Eric hovered nearby, still uneasy from the confrontation in the streets. Lara stopped suddenly, her golden eyes locking onto Thomas. "You're a fool for getting involved. Do you even know who those people were?" Thomas met her gaze, calm but firm. "I know enough to recognize danger when I see it. What I don't understand is why they're after you." Lara hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned away, pulling her tattered cloak tighter around her shoulders. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Thomas stepped forward, his voice softening. "Try me. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Lara laughed bitterly. "Carry it alone? That's all I've ever done." Eric, standing by the doorway, couldn't hold back anymore. "Look, lady, we just risked our lives for you. The least you can do is explain why armed thugs are chasing you through the streets." Lara's head snapped toward him, and for a moment her defiant mask cracked. "You want to know why? Fine." She pulled back her hood, revealing the faint markings on her forehead in full detail. "Do you recognize these symbols?" Thomas leaned closer, his brows furrowing. They looked like intricate tattoos, but something about them felt more significant, almost regal. "I've seen similar patterns in the archives," he said slowly. "They're used by certain alien clans, aren't they?" Lara nodded, her expression unreadable. "Not just any clan. The royal bloodline of my home planet, Elantria." Eric's jaw dropped. "Wait, you're saying you're royalty?" "Was royalty," Lara corrected, her voice tinged with bitterness. "My family was overthrown in a coup when I was a child. The new regime branded us traitors and hunted us down. I've been running ever since." Thomas frowned, his mind racing to piece it together. "And those men who attacked you, they're part of this regime?" "Not exactly," Lara replied, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They're bounty hunters, hired to drag me back to Elantria. My existence is a threat to the current ruler. If I return, it'll be to face public execution." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, but why hide as a beggar? Why not seek asylum with the Galactic Council, or someone who could help?" Lara's laugh was harsh. "The Galactic Council. They don't care about exiled royals. I'm just another displaced alien to them. Begging was safer. Invisible." Thomas took a deep breath, his voice measured. "Lara, if what you're saying is true, then you're more than just a fugitive. You're a symbol of hope for your people." She looked at him sharply. "Hope? Don't romanticize this, human. I'm just trying to survive." "And yet," Thomas countered, "you haven't given up. That says something." Before Lara could respond, the room's security alarm blared. Eric rushed to the control panel, his hands flying over the interface. "We've got movement outside. Multiple heat signatures." Lara's face paled. "They found me." Thomas grabbed a communicator, his tone decisive. "Eric, lock down the embassy. We're not letting them take her." Eric hesitated, glancing between Thomas and Lara. "Sir, this could escalate into a diplomatic incident." Thomas didn't flinch. "Then it's my job to handle it." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the neon lights. A group of shadowy figures approached the embassy, their movements calculated and coordinated. At their center was a tall alien with red eyes that seemed to glow with malice. He carried himself with the air of someone accustomed to command. Inside, Lara's breathing quickened. "That's him," she whispered. "Karnak, the regime's enforcer." Thomas glanced out the window, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his stun baton and heading for the door. Lara caught his arm. "You can't fight him. He's dangerous." Thomas looked at her, his voice calm but unyielding. "I've dealt with dangerous people before. Trust me." She hesitated, then let go, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the hallway. For the first time in years, someone was risking everything for her. The thought was both terrifying and comforting. Thomas stepped into the embassy courtyard, his stun baton crackling with energy. The figures stopped, their leader stepping forward with a cold smile. "Human," Karnak said, his voice a low growl. "You're interfering in matters that don't concern you." Thomas stood his ground. "When someone seeks refuge on Earth, it becomes our concern." Karnak's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Noble words. Let's see if they hold up under pressure. Without warning, Karnak lunged, faster than Thomas anticipated. The stun baton crackled as it connected with Karnak's arm, but the enforcer barely flinched. Thomas dodged a counterattack, his diplomatic training allowing him to keep up, but Karnak's strength was overwhelming. Inside, Lara watched through a security feed, her fists clenched. Memories of her family's fall flashed in her mind, the helplessness, the fear. She couldn't let it happen again. Grabbing a nearby weapon, she bolted out of the room before Eric could stop her. The fight in the courtyard was fierce, but Thomas was losing ground. Karnak knocked the Batman from his hand, pinning him against a wall. "Humans should know their place," he sneered, raising his weapon for a final blow. A shot rang out, striking the weapon from Karnak's hand. Both men turned to see Lara standing in the doorway, a blaster in her hands and fire in her eyes. "Let him go," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Karnak's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, princess." "No," Lara replied, stepping closer. "The mistake was underestimating me." The standoff set the stage for Lara's decision to stop running and confront her past. For Thomas, it solidified his resolve to protect her, no matter the cost. But both knew this was only the beginning of a larger battle. Growing bond. The embassy was quiet, the kind of tense silence that follows a storm. Lara sat on the edge of a chair in the secured conference room, her hands trembling despite the weapon she still gripped. Across from her, Thomas nursed a bruise on his temple, the result of his fight with Karnak. Eric paced nervously by the door, checking the security feed every few seconds. "That was reckless," Thomas finally said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You could have gotten yourself killed." Lara's golden eyes flicked up to meet his. "You were the one about to die," she snapped. "I couldn't just stand there and watch." Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair point. But now we've escalated things. Karnak won't just walk away after this." Eric, still pacing, muttered under his breath. "He's right. We're all targets now." Lara leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Welcome to my world." The weight of her words hung in the room. Thomas studied her for a moment before speaking. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? About Karnak, your past, all of it." She hesitated, her expression guarded. "Because trusting people has never worked out for me. Every time I let someone in, they betrayed me. Or worse." "I'm not them," Thomas said simply. Lara stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. She found none. "You're either very brave," she said quietly, "or very stupid." "Maybe a bit of both," Thomas replied with a faint smile. Eric stopped pacing and turned toward them, his frustration spilling over. "This is touching and all, but we need a plan. We can't just sit here waiting for Karnak to regroup." Thomas nodded, his demeanor shifting to one of focus. "Agreed. Lara, you said Karnak is after you because you're the last member of the royal bloodline. What does that mean for Elantria? Does anyone there still support your family?" Lara's brow furrowed as she thought. "There are pockets of resistance, but they're scattered and weak. Most of them don't even know I'm alive." Karnak made sure of that. Thomas leaned forward. "If we could get word to them, Will they rally behind you? Lyra hesitated. Maybe. But it's a risk. If the message is intercepted, it could lead Karnak straight to them. It's a risk worth taking, Thomas said firmly. We need allies, and you need to stop running. This is your chance to take control of your story. Lyra blinked, caught off guard by his conviction. For years, she had been defined by fear, by the need to survive at all costs. The idea of fighting back felt alien and dangerous, but also thrilling. All right, she said slowly. But if we're doing this, we need to do it right. No half measures. Thomas smiled, a spark of hope lighting in his eyes. That's the spirit. Over the next few days, the embassy became a hive of activity. Thomas worked tirelessly to draft a secure message to the Elantrian resistance, while Eric set up advanced encryption systems to ensure it couldn't be traced. Lyra, meanwhile, found herself in an unfamiliar role: advisor. This isn't just about logistics, she explained during one of their strategy sessions. Elantrians value strength and unity. If they think I'm weak or unsure, they won't follow me. Thomas nodded, taking notes. So we present you as a leader in exile, ready to reclaim what's rightfully yours. Someone they can believe in. Lyra snorted. That's a nice way of saying we lie to them. It's not a lie, Thomas said gently. It's who you can become. The words lingered in Lyra's mind long after the meeting ended. Could she really become the leader Thomas seemed to see in her? Or was she still just a scared girl hiding behind tattered cloaks? As the plan took shape, an unexpected bond began to grow between Lyra and Thomas. She found herself opening up about her past, her childhood in the palace, her parents' betrayal, the night she fled into the wilderness. Thomas listened without judgment, sharing stories of his own struggles as a diplomat navigating the murky waters of interstellar politics. One evening, as they worked late in the embassy's dimly lit war room, Thomas handed her a cup of warm tea. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, he said quietly, but you're still standing. That's not weakness, Lyra. That's strength. Lyra stared into the tea, her throat tight with emotion. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, not since her family's fall. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Thomas could respond, Eric burst into the room, his face pale. We've got a problem. The message to the resistance had been sent, but it hadn't gone unnoticed. The embassy's security system had picked up unusual activity on the network. Someone was trying to trace the signal. Karnak, Lyra said grimly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He's already onto us. Thomas's jaw clenched. Then we have to move fast. If the resistance gets the message before he does, we still have a chance. Eric shook his head. It's not just the signal. Our perimeter sensors just picked up multiple heat signatures. He's here. Lyra's heart sank. They weren't ready for a direct confrontation, not yet. We need to evacuate, she said urgently. If he gets inside, we're all dead. Thomas stood, his eyes blazing with determination. No, we stand our ground. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about sending a message to Karnak, to the resistance, to everyone watching. Lyra isn't running anymore. Lyra stared at him, her mind racing. For the first time in years, she felt something more than fear. She felt hope, and it terrified her. All right, she said, her voice steady. Let's do this. As the embassy prepared for the inevitable confrontation, Lyra couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end or the start of something greater. A new purpose. The air inside the embassy felt electric, charged with anticipation and dread. Outside, the rain had returned, hammering against the walls like a war drum. Thomas stood at the center of the secured conference room, his hands resting on a holographic map of the embassy grounds. Around him, Lyra, Eric, and a handful of staffers watched intently. This isn't just about holding them off, Thomas began, his voice calm but commanding. We need to send a message. Lyra's survival isn't just a victory for us. It's a declaration of resistance. Lara shifted uncomfortably. I'm not a symbol. I'm just trying to stay alive. Thomas met her gaze, his expression unwavering. You're more than that now. Whether you like it or not, people are watching. And they need to see that you're willing to fight. Her golden eyes narrowed. Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're hunting. You think I don't know what it's like to be hunted? Thomas countered, surprising her with the steel in his tone. I've been in rooms where a single wrong word could have ended my career or my life. I faced people who wanted me gone because I was inconvenient to their plans. I'm still here. And so are you. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lara looked away, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't want this responsibility, but Thomas's conviction was impossible to ignore. Fine, she said at last. What's the plan? The plan was deceptively simple. Hold the embassy long enough for the resistance to receive their message and respond. Eric had rigged the building's automated defenses, while the staff prepared fallback positions in case of a breach. Lara, despite her protests, was given a weapon and positioned alongside Thomas in the main corridor. As the team worked, Lara couldn't help but notice how seamlessly Thomas took charge. He wasn't just a diplomat. He was a leader, someone who inspired confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a quality she envied and reluctantly admired. Do you always do this? She asked as they prepared their position. Throw yourself into impossible situations for people you barely know. Thomas smiled faintly, only when it feels like the right thing to do. Lara shook her head. You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the dumbest. Maybe a bit of both, he replied, echoing his earlier words. Their moment was interrupted by Eric's voice crackling over the comms. They're here. The first wave came quickly, cloaked figures moving with military precision. They bypassed the automated defenses with shocking ease, forcing Thomas and Lara to engage directly. The corridor erupted into chaos, the sound of blaster fire echoing off the walls. Lara fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. For years, she had avoided conflict, relying on stealth and evasion to survive. But now, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas, something in her had shifted. She wasn't just running anymore, she was fighting back. You're a natural, Thomas said between shots, his tone laced with both admiration and urgency. Don't get used to it, Lara shot back, though there was a hint of a smile on her lips. The second wave was larger, more organized. Thomas's team fell back, retreating to the conference room where they could regroup. Karnak's forces pressed their advantage, but the embassy's defenses slowed their advance. As the battle raged, Thomas's communicator buzzed with an incoming message. Eric's voice was frantic. The resistance responded. They got the message, but they need proof that Lara's alive before they commit. Can you send a live feed? Thomas glanced at Lara, who was reloading her weapon. It's now or never. Are you ready to show them who you are? Lara hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spent years hiding, avoiding attention at all costs. The thought of stepping into the spotlight made her stomach churn. But then she looked at Thomas, his determination, his unwavering belief in her, and something inside her shifted. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. As Karnak's forces breached the outer defenses, Thomas set up a live feed in the conference room. Lara stood in front of the camera, her weapon slung over her shoulder. She looked into the lens, her golden eyes blazing with determination. This is Lara of Elantria, she began, her voice ringing with authority. For years, I've been hunted, silenced, and forgotten. But no more. I am alive, and I will not run. To those who still believe in freedom, in justice, stand with me. Together, we can reclaim what was taken from us. The message was brief but powerful. As soon as it was sent, Thomas shut down the feed and turned to Lara. That was perfect. I hope so, she replied, her hands trembling despite her composed exterior. Because if this doesn't work, we're out of options. The final wave came with devastating force, led by Karnak himself. The enforcer moved like a predator, cutting through the embassy's defenses with brutal efficiency. By the time he reached the conference room, only Thomas and Lyra remained to face him. Karnak's red eyes gleamed as he stepped through the ruined doorway. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Princess." Lyra raised her weapon, her voice steady. "And you've been a tyrant for far too long." Karnak laughed, a low, menacing sound. "Bold words. Let's see if you can back them up." As the showdown began, Thomas and Lyra knew they were outmatched, but they also knew they weren't fighting alone. Somewhere out there, the resistance had heard Lyra's call. All they had to do was hold on a little longer. And so they stood their ground, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The final stand. The air was thick with tension as Karnak stepped into the shattered conference room. His crimson eyes swept over the scene, lingering on Lyra and Thomas as they stood side by side. Behind him, his remaining forces fanned out, their weapons aimed and ready. Outside, the rain had turned to a downpour, thunder rumbling like the voice of the cosmos itself. "Impressive," Karnak said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've managed to delay the inevitable longer than I expected. But this ends now." Thomas tightened his grip on his weapon, his bruised face set in determination. "You underestimate her, Karnak. That's your first mistake." "And your last," Lyra added, stepping forward. The fire in her golden eyes made even Karnak hesitate. "You've spent your life hunting me, trying to erase me, but I'm still here, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." Karnak chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Bold words, Princess. Let's see how long they last." The battle erupted in an instant. Karnak's forces opened fire, the room flashing with bursts of energy as Lyra and Thomas dove for cover. Thomas returned fire with calculated precision, his training as a diplomat-turned-survivor showing in every move. Lyra, for her part, fought like someone with nothing left to lose. "You've been holding out on me," Thomas called over the chaos, ducking as a bolt of energy sizzled past his head. "Survival teaches you things," Lyra replied, firing back with deadly accuracy. Despite their efforts, it became clear that Karnak was no ordinary foe. He moved with inhuman speed and strength, disarming Thomas with a single devastating blow before turning his full attention to Lyra. "You've always been a thorn in my side," Karnak growled, advancing on her, the loose end that needed cutting. Lyra stood her ground, her weapon trained on him. "And you've always been a coward, hiding behind your power. But you're not invincible." With a roar, Karnak lunged. Lyra fired, but he deflected the shot with a metallic gauntlet, the blast ricocheting into the ceiling. In an instant, he was on her, his strength overwhelming. He knocked her weapon aside and grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. "You're finished," he snarled, his grip tightening. Thomas, disarmed and bleeding, struggled to his feet, his gaze locked onto Lyra, her face contorted in pain as she fought against Karnak's iron grip. He knew he couldn't overpower the enforcer, but he didn't need to. His eyes darted to the live feed console, still active and broadcasting. "Hey, Karnak," Thomas shouted, drawing the enforcer's attention. "Smile for the cameras." Karnak's head snapped around, his eyes widening as he realized the truth. The entire confrontation was being streamed to the resistance and beyond. His cruelty, his brutality, was on full display for the galaxy to see. "You arrogant fool," Karnak bellowed, releasing Lyra and charging at Thomas. But Thomas was ready. He dove for a concealed panel, hitting a button that activated the room's emergency defenses. A pulse of energy surged through the floor, knocking Karnak off balance and giving Lyra the opening she needed. With a roar of her own, Lyra grabbed a fallen weapon and swung it with all her strength, striking Karnak across the face. The enforcer staggered, blood dripping from a gash on his cheek. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "You're done," Lyra said, her voice cold and steady. Your reign of terror ends here." Karnak sneered, his confidence faltering. "You think this changes anything? You're just a scared little girl playing at being a hero." "No," Lara replied, stepping closer. "I'm a leader." As Karnak struggled to his feet, the sound of approaching ships filled the air. Through the shattered windows, Lara and Thomas could see vessels descending, resistance ships, their markings unmistakable. The message had reached its intended audience, and reinforcements had arrived. Karnak's forces began to retreat, their morale shattered. The enforcer himself snarled in frustration, realizing his position was no longer tenable. "This isn't over," he spat, backing toward the exit. "Yes, it is," Lara said, leveling her weapon at him. But before she could fire, Karnak activated a hidden device on his wrist, vanishing in a flash of light. The room fell silent, the only sound the rain pounding against the roof. Lara lowered her weapon, her hands shaking. Thomas stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "You gave them hope." Lara turned to him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We did it." As the resistance fighters poured into the embassy, cheers erupted among the survivors. Lara was surrounded by her people, many of whom fell to their knees in reverence. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever: belonging. Thomas watched from a distance, a faint smile on his lips. Lara caught his eye and walked over, her step steady despite the weight of everything that had just happened. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Thomas nodded. "This is your fight now. Your people need you." Lara hesitated, then reached out and clasped his hand. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his smile warm. "You were always capable of this. You just needed someone to remind you." As Lara turned back to the crowd, standing tall among her people, Thomas felt a swell of pride. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading, and the galaxy would never be the same. But in the shadows, a pair of red eyes watched from afar. Karnak wasn't finished, and neither was this story. From beggar to leader's wife. The city outside the embassy had transformed. What had once been a place of fear, of whispers and shadows, now buzzed with the vibrancy of hope. The resistance had taken control, the oppressive regime dismantled piece by piece, and the people of Elantria had found their voice again. At the center of it all stood Lara, no longer the beggar in the shadows, but a symbol of defiance, a beacon of the future. For days, Thomas had remained by her side, helping her navigate the complexities of leadership, though his role was growing smaller. He knew his place now. Lara was no longer just someone he had helped. It was clear she was a force in her own right, someone the galaxy could no longer ignore. He had given her the tools to step into her power, but it was her courage that had carried her this far. And yet, despite the monumental changes, despite the cheers of her people and the weight of the crown she had reluctantly accepted, Lara found herself at a crossroads. The fight was far from over, and though the battle for her planet had been won, the real question lingered. What kind of leader would she become? The grand hall of the newly restored Elantrian palace was filled with dignitaries, resistance leaders, and people who had fought alongside her. The sounds of celebration echoed through the marble columns, but in the midst of the revelry, Lara felt oddly alone. She stood by the balcony, gazing out over the city. Her city now, and felt a tug in her chest. "You look like you're a million miles away," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Thomas, his familiar presence offering her a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos. He had always been a steady presence in her life, but tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, she was more than just a survivor. Tonight, she was a leader, and the weight of that role was heavy. "I'm just trying to take it all in," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It's overwhelming. I never thought it would end like this." Thomas smiled faintly, stepping beside her and leaning against the railing. "You've earned every moment of it. You fought for this. for them. She turned to him, searching his face. "And you? What happens to you now?" Thomas hesitated, looking out at the crowd below. He had been a part of her journey from the beginning, but he had always known his place. He was a diplomat, a man of words, not of war. "I'm not sure. I've done what I came here to do. You've got everything you need now. You don't need me." Lyra's heart twisted at the thought. She had grown so accustomed to his presence, to the quiet confidence he offered her, that the idea of him leaving felt like a small betrayal, though she knew it wasn't one. He had done his part, but she didn't feel ready to let go. "Not yet. I'm not ready for you to leave," she confessed, her voice almost a whisper. Thomas met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. "You're ready for more than that. You're ready to lead, Lyra. And leading means you'll have to let go of some things." A wave of emotion washed over her, but before she could respond, a commotion below caught her attention. The crowd was parting, and a familiar figure approached the base of the grand staircase. It was one of the last figures she expected to see. Karnak, the enforcer, though injured and weathered from the earlier battles, stood at the center of the room, his hands shackled. His once powerful presence was diminished, but the hatred in his eyes had not faded. He had been captured and brought before her as a symbol of the regime's fall, a prisoner to be tried for his crimes. Yet, as Lyra's eyes met his, she saw something that gave her pause, something she hadn't expected. Regret, fear, and perhaps, just perhaps, a glimmer of understanding. Karnak's voice rang out, rough and defiant. "You may have won, princess, but you'll never be free of the blood you've spilled. You've become the very thing you swore to fight against." Lyra felt a chill at his words, but she didn't flinch. "You're wrong," she said steadily, her voice carrying through the hall. "I've learned that being a leader means making difficult choices. I didn't want this life, but it was forced upon me. And I will make sure that no one ever has to suffer the way you made my people suffer." Karnak's sneer deepened, but he remained silent as the guards led him away. Thomas watched the exchange in silence, his expression thoughtful. Lyra had changed, not just in her role as a leader, but in the way she carried herself. She was no longer the broken, fearful girl who had once hidden in the shadows. She had become something else entirely. Something strong. As the night wore on, the final chapter of their story together seemed to unfold before her. The celebrations continued, but Lyra found herself retreating to the quiet sanctuary of her chambers, her mind still processing everything that had happened. She had taken her first steps as a leader, and now she had to decide how far she was willing to go. Thomas found her there, looking out the window at the darkened city below. He hadn't expected to see her so soon after the public display. Yet there she was, calm and poised as ever. "I don't know what comes next," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not alone anymore," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "Whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." Lyra turned to him, her eyes searching his face for the first time. There was something in his gaze, something deeper than mere friendship. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel it, too. "You've been my strength, Thomas," she said quietly, "and I don't think I can do this without you." He stepped closer, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think you need me. But I want to be here, with you." In that moment, everything that had led them here seemed to fade away. The pain, the loss, the struggle, all that mattered was the future and the choice she would make. And as Thomas reached for her hand, Lyra knew, deep down, that she wasn't just ready to lead her people. She was ready to embrace the life she had fought for, to build a future not just for her world, but for them. She had gone from a beggar to a leader, and now, as she stood at the precipice of everything she had ever wanted, she knew one thing with certainty: she was not alone. And together, they would face whatever the universe had in store. The people of Elantria had their queen, and the galaxy had its hope.